good to see you. Oop, there we go, recording in progress. It's good to see you and Jimmy and all the other regular attendees here. Transit Choices is really an essential part of the transit advocacy ecosystem here in Baltimore. You guys do a great job, and it's been nice to work with you, and obviously we'll continue to work with you going forward. But you have an important role to play, and I'm hopeful that today I can give you some information. We can have some discussion. I know that this group knows a lot about this stuff, so in a way you kind of start, you don't have to start at the very beginning, and that'll give me some advantage in terms of some of the things I'm going to talk about. Let me also acknowledge Don Halligan, who is familiar to folks, I think, as well. Don is the lead staff for the commission. He is at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, which provides staff support for us. So thank you very much for having me. Word about my background today, my Zoom background. It's the 101st air-conditioned bus rolled out by the then Baltimore Transit Company, which makes it pre-1970. Baltimore Transit Company was absorbed into what then eventually became the MTA in 1970. It used to be a private company, which actually explains a lot about the background of how Baltimore Transit evolved and why we sort of are where we are today. I used to have another Zoom background that I still use, except it looks like I'm going to get run over by a bus in that one. And I concluded that that was a risk I was taking every day anyway in this job. So I've gone for this one. A little entertainment, pre-1970 bus. Okay, so I think this group has a pretty good idea of what the BRTC is about, but we were formed in 2023 in General Assembly. We didn't really kick off till about a year later, and we've been working hard throughout 2024. We got started, I think, in February. So this will be the end of this year will be our first nearly full year, which will culminate also in a statutorily required report from us at the end of the year. So that'll be a good summary, I think, of where we've been. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of that, but I want to focus on a couple of things in particular that are timely and time sensitive. Don, do you have our slides? You want to put them up for us? Excellent. Can we? Yeah, thanks. Let's roll to the next one. Okay. So as I said, we have a statutory charge that involves a variety of things, specific things like reviewing the Regional Transportation Plan, all sorts of things that are required for us to do. But our broad charge is to advocate for and provide oversight of MTA as well as the lot systems. In addition to statutory things, those of you who have been following the meetings may know that we also have 3 work groups that we formed at our own discretion. One is focused on project and program design. It's trying to figure out what are the efficient ways that we could potentially deliver, that MTA could better deliver projects and programs. There are issues related to procurement, issues related to the way MTA, as I mentioned earlier, sort of evolved differently from other modes. And we're trying to get to the bottom of that to advocate for as efficient a process as possible. We have a work group focused on rider experience, obviously sort of self-explanatory. What's this look like for the riders? And a third group focused on staffing, which is looking at staffing issues within the agency, not only at all levels, professional engineering staff, which the MTA outsources quite a bit for a variety of reasons, and also including operators and such, where frankly the recruitment drive has been very successful. The MTA still struggles with some vacancy issues, it's not some vacancy so much as attendance issues, but actually it has done a really good job of recruiting operators, especially coming out of COVID. So we've got a number of those things going on. And what I've described more broadly in the past is that we have 2 big things: accountability and advocacy. And accountability is the kinds of things I'm talking about, trying to work with the MTA to identify areas where there might be room for improvement. But I will tell you that in the year I've been doing this, I've been very, very impressed by MTA's professional staff, from the leadership, Holly Arnold, many of us know, all of us know, through the professional staff, all the way, including operators and service maintenance and so on. It is a great team at MTA doing a great job with too few resources. And therefore, I feel like in a way I've been focusing more lately on advocacy than accountability, not because we're not going to be worried about accountability or because it's not necessary, but because what MTA really needs is broad-based advocacy to bring it the resources that it needs. And the commission is a new arrival on the scene. You guys have been here a long time, but there's never been a formal commission, state-sanctioned commission in law whose job it is to advocate for and look out for MTA. And I think that's the role that we're trying to play as aggressively and actively as possible. So among our responsibilities, and this is one of the two things I want to focus on today, the BRTC reviews annual budget requests by MTA, including the recently released draft CTP 25 to 30. Let's keep going. This slide, sorry for this little out of order, just a reminder of the membership of the commission appointed by the governor and the three county executives and the mayor with a broad base. So I think you all know that from prior presentations. Let's keep going. So again, in this group, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but I want to just reiterate that transit means economic access. Public transit's a lifeline for many Maryland residents who lack access to personal vehicles. As you know, the statistics, and particularly in the city, are very poor on this front in terms of what it takes for people to get to work and how many jobs for which you need a car at this point. People don't have cars. It particularly affects urban areas, underserved communities, and it affects access to everything, right? Healthcare, education, employment, and that means economic mobility and inclusion. Transit usage, interestingly, is highest among, not surprisingly, the lowest income brackets, also the highest because I think there are folks at the higher end who are transit advocates and who otherwise want to be supporting transit, but that's where the usage is highest. Obviously, it is far higher among folks with limited incomes. But so public transportation is essential for everybody for economic participation and opportunity, and by prioritizing transit, we can ensure equitable access to economic opportunities. This is a very familiar territory to transit choices. Let's keep going. The other sort of pillar is economic development. It also means creating jobs for people, connecting transit systems along with the day-to-day, constructing transit systems, along with day-to-day running of systems creates employment. And obviously, it supports the existence of all sorts of non-transit related jobs. And, transit creates value. It raises property value in your transit stops. I think we all know that. It means more money. There's a concept of value capture. And I would hope that everybody has been following what are really extraordinary efforts by MDOT and DHCD working together, and MEDCO, frankly, to restart the Transit-Oriented Development Program, which was going along pretty well. And the O'Malley administration came to a screeching halt, no pun intended, in the Hogan administration. And now has been restarted in a very significant way with efforts here in this area at Reisterstown Plaza. And, there's just been a release of a study, opportunities around MARC stations. So the TOD folks are terrific. I think you've heard from them. If you haven't, at some point, Robin, it would be useful to kind of get them in to talk a little bit about what they're doing, because that program is robust. And the partnership between MDOT and DHCD reflects, I think, a greater cooperation. We've restructured the Smart Growth Cabinet to include more robust decision-making, to give an enhanced role for DHCD as a partner for MDOT, recognizing that smart growth and transit-oriented development is not a transit function exclusively. It requires others. And of course, the governor has announced a very ambitious housing initiative, which is an opportunity to tie housing to TOD. Okay, next. So MTA has absolutely critical crisis level capital needs, in my view, and I think most of you agree. MTA requires significant reinvestment. Its infrastructure is aging. Demands continue to grow. And we need upgrades in all the modes: bus, light rail, metro. And that's not enough, because we need expansion to new services, to new areas. Obviously, the red line is very much on everybody's mind. And that's something we can discuss as well. And without this investment, MTA is just not going to be able to provide reliable, safe transit service. We've seen what has happened recently with respect to light rail interruptions, again, which MTA is coping with extraordinarily well. This is not about MTA's people or MTA's systems, or internally. It's about the infrastructure. It's about obviously the rolling stock, the vehicles, and it's about the overall system, and how frankly I think it's extraordinary that MTA can do as well as it can do, considering sort of what it's working with in terms of resources. So core services in a state of disrepair, disproportionately impacting public transportation, particularly in lower income communities, particularly in African-American residents in those communities, again, acutely felt in the city of Baltimore in particular, but also in the surrounding counties, particularly in Baltimore County. And we all know about historic inequities with respect to those communities. This isn't helping. In fact, it's making it worse. So everybody knows about the CTP. I don't have to give this group too much of a primer, I hope, on the CTP. It's the 6-year capital planning document for transportation in Maryland, published by MDOT. It is just more or less just come out. We're now in a draft period. It will become finalized at the end of the year and become finally finalized in the General Assembly session as part of the state's budget. And again, I want to be clear that, you know, I'm going to have some critical things to say about the CTP, and I think we all should, and for a variety of reasons. But MDOT and MTA are really committed to the state's transportation infrastructure, and the commission really knows the constraints that they're under. It's a revenue problem more than anything else, and we will have to get to that issue, and I'll talk about it briefly today. But you know, we just don't have enough revenue in the system, and that's what's doing this. We're not wasting money on the expense side. We just don't have enough money on the revenue side. This is not, and I don't mind saying this publicly, this is not like sparring with the prior administration on the need for transit or the importance for transit or anything of the sort. This administration, from the governor through the secretary, through the administrator, and all the staff, truly value transit as a preferred mode. The governor, of course, has made a bold commitment to the Red Line, and we appreciate that. We know they mean it, but now we have to figure out how to operationalize that by getting enough money in the system to allow them to fulfill their goals. So while we feel that way, we really have tremendous concerns. And let me just give you a couple of numbers to kind of frame this. MTA every 5 years does a capital needs inventory. In 2022, the last capital needs inventory, the CNI, said that we needed $512 million a year in order to address its capital needs. And it looks out, Don can correct me, I think it looks out 10 years, but it's updated every 5 years. Correct me if I'm wrong. Don always corrects me if I'm wrong, which I would. The draft CTP, the current draft CTP, meets this CNI threshold of $512 million in only 2 of the 6 years. It needs, if you just do the math, $368 million more to meet the 2022 CNI levels. So that's the gap based upon the 2022 CNI levels. But those CNI levels, we've heard from the administrator, are expected to double when the new CNI comes out in 2025 next year, which will make the issue even more acute. So if you're doing the math, that's about $900 million annually, which is about $9 billion over the decade that the CNI is looking for. And you know, obviously there's an enormous gap. The $188 million relates to the so-called Transit Safety and Investment Act. This was an initiative of many people, but including our favorite comptroller, Brooke Learman, when she was in the General Assembly. The legislature passed in 2021 mandates for minimum investment in state of good repair in the system. The 2025 and 26 statutory mandates are $450 million, and the current CTP allocates $336 million in 25 and $376 million in 26. If you add all that up, that means that we're falling short of the TSIA mandate by $188 million across just those 2 budget years. How, you ask, can you fall short of a statutorily mandated funding level? And the answer is that there's a process called BRFA, Budget Reconciliation and I forget what it is, but it's BRFA. And every year, the General Assembly has to pass a BRFA. And in that BRFA, they can basically, for budget purposes, blow through the Transit Safety and Investment Act or other mandated funding when the circumstances permit. So the mechanism here would be that the MDOT would have to ask the General Assembly to essentially, through the BRFA, allow it not to meet, to violate the TSIA numbers. That is, it sounds bad, it is bad, it doesn't make any sense to me, and I'm hopeful that that is not going to happen. But I'll tell you that that's what the current CTP does, And so not only are we talking about a CNI that's done by the agency, but we're talking about funding levels that are done by that are enacted in law by the legislature. So that's a real crisis and a real problem. The $1.2 billion is how much Purple Line funding there is in the draft CTP. About 25% of the program capital funding available to MTA goes to the Purple Line in Montgomery and Prince George's counties. And I'll talk about this briefly now and again about our friends at WMATA. Your transit choices. I'm a transit advocate. We all love transit. We do not want anything to shortchange the Purple Line or the WMATA system. But I would argue that Baltimore Metro does not benefit substantially. It does benefit to some extent, certainly, but it doesn't benefit substantially from Purple Line funding. The Purple Line has been, as you know, the budgeting, there have been all sorts of budget issues, all sorts of additional investments, all sorts of needs. And what is happening there is, it's costing a lot more than it was supposed to. And a lot of MTA's money is going to the Purple Line. Again, I'm not begrudging the Purple Line. I love the Purple Line. It's just that it does tend to affect the way we look at the MTA numbers. And you have to dig down. You don't have to dig that far, but you have to dig down to understand what's going on there. And then $213 million relates to a federal grant for light rail car replacement, and we'll go to the next slide for details on that. Perhaps you've heard about this, but the MTA, and this is terrific and remarkable, with the help of federal delegation and others, got $213 million to replace aging light rail vehicles. Very, very important. But the draft CTP doesn't allocate enough funds for state of good repair projects to deal with stations and tracks and sort of the light rail infrastructure that surrounds those cars. And that means that there's the potential for the federal grant to be lost, literally. At a recent, several times publicly, the administrator has been asked and has said very clearly, she thinks we have about a year to fix that before we run the serious risk of the federal grant being taken back. It is impossible for me to imagine that the people involved here are going to allow that federal grant to be taken back. It has a little bit of the odor of the red line. This administration, from top to bottom, is radically different than the prior one, and I'm confident is not going to allow the $213 million federal grant to be forfeited when it's so desperately needed. And yet, at the moment, the numbers don't support it in the CTP. So it's critical that get resolved. Let's keep going. So I want to give you a few numbers, and depending on how closely you've been following this, you may have heard this. There are in the current CTP $672 million in total deferrals, which are really cuts. Deferrals is a bit of a bureaucratic word. I mean, they're basically from the prior CTP to the current, there are $672 million in reductions. And of the $1.3 billion reduction in the overall CTP, which is happening because of diminished revenues, motor vehicle fuel tax, et cetera, the MTA deferrals represent $672 million. So there you have, and I won't read them, the deferrals in each of the various modes. They include, as you can see, though, the major modes, light rail, bus, metro, MARC. I've highlighted a few things that I think have attracted some attention. There is $35 million that is being cut for escalator and elevator work at various stations, which are causing all sorts of problems for mobility impaired people, and even for people who are not, who have to figure out how to get up and down in those stations. A lot of folks have expressed interest in the North-South Corridor Study, another initiative that's been undertaken. That has been completely cut from the current CTP, $3.7 million. And then there are a variety of other things. And on the next 3 pages, and we just pick one for the moment, obviously, I'm not going to review this, and I don't expect you to be able to review it or see it in this format, but it's available to you. This is in the CTP, and it reflects for 3 pages each of those deferrals. And when you get to the 3rd page, which Don will, I'm sure, get to in a moment, you'll see the $672 million at the bottom. So you can go through there and pick out your favorite deferral, but I summarized them for you several pages earlier, and these are very, very significant deferrals that are going to have a real impact some are less important than others, to be sure, but all of them are important. And some of them are just literally mission critical. The entire zero emission bus program, which happened to be, sorry, Don, back the other way on the screen, has been deferred. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. And, again, no, I can't read all these to you, but you should look at these. And in this format, what we asked MTA to do, and it's a little bit different than what you'll see in the CTP, we specifically asked them to give us a brief description and an assessment of the impacts. If you look in the CTP, it's just a list. And we said, all right, tell us what that means, because it's a little bit, some of these are very abbreviated. And then tell us what you think the impacts would be with respect to parameters like rider safety, like forfeiture of federal funds, matching grants, et cetera. So I encourage you, please, to take a look at that. And I know this deck will be available to you, so you'll get to see it there, and you should be able to read it. Let's keep going, Don, to the. So, again, this should be sort of obvious to everybody, right? Deferring essential projects will directly impact MTA's ability to maintain its infrastructure and ensure a state of good repair. It will jeopardize essential projects, including, and these are just some examples of what you saw or what you would have seen in the chart above, the Eastern Bus Division rehab, modernization of light rail, metro rail improvements, and then we are in a cycle of decline, and deferred maintenance in this amount is really going to make things obviously much worse, much more quickly. Also, Don, go ahead, please. The impact on rider experience and safety. Again, no sort of revelations here. Deferrals will lead to a decline in rider satisfaction. You saw some of the discussion about, light rail issues around one of the recent games where people said, I can't rely on this light rail if this is what it's going to be like. Again, MTA, I think, created a bus bridge, efficiently got people where they needed to go. But if we are going to attract ultimately what we need to attract, which is riders who are making choices, not just riders who are using this as a matter of necessity, we can't do it with an unreliable and unpredictable system because of the deficiencies that we're talking about. Obviously, this leads to safety concerns throughout the system. Sorry, Don, one more back. And potential service disruptions and costs. Again, pretty self-evident. So let's go to the next slide. I want to just spend a minute on what I would sort of call the WMATA conundrum. We've got two major transit systems in this state, and they're very, very different in who they serve. They're very, very different in how they're funded. And in some ways, they're not comparable, but in other ways they are. And certainly our obligation as a state to fund them and to fund the riders within those systems is equal. At a recent session, I think Delegate Edelson asked the secretary, or no, I'm sorry, it was Councilman Cohen asked the Secretary of Transportation, well, do we value riders in Baltimore less than we value riders in DC? And of course the secretary said no, and of course he means it. Paul Wiedefeld certainly values all the riders equally, but the system has evolved over time such that there are fundamental inequities that do have to be acknowledged and addressed. The $26.7 million number is what WMATA is seeing an increase in the next CTP year through the CTP. And it is very difficult and awkward to get this issue on the table, but WMATA, and I've said this publicly before, it's been reported, I think, in some media stories. WMATA has critical unmet needs, and we are not trying to pit one transit system against another. That's not what transit advocates should be doing. WMATA also faces cuts in the 6-year CTP, but it does see $26.7 million increase in the next budget year, while MTA is going down. As I think this is a conversation for perhaps a different time, but we are, that WMATA has a very different funding structure. The state has contractual obligations and a tri-party agreement with DC and Virginia. WMATA is largely funded outside the CTP. So, but those are issues in themselves in that WMATA essentially is getting funded, to use a colloquial expression, off the top, whereas MTA is getting funded down in the midst of the CTP process. So I think, all of us who are involved in this are trying to figure out, and I encourage you to help us figure out and to think about how we address, let's go back again for a moment. Sorry, just let me finish that point. How we address this fundamental problem, because we are not trying to create an MTA versus WMATA dynamic, but you have to acknowledge that the systems are not funded equally. There are all sorts of other conceptual differences. WMATA, of course, has an independent board. It has advocated actively for itself. The commission that I chair is not, and this will be the second part of my conversation, is not a full separate board. Therefore, and it hasn't, and it's existed, pardon me, for only 1 year. So there are just so many structural differences between the two that frankly explain pretty easily why we are where we are, but where we are doesn't make any sense. And we have to find a way to rectify that. So now let's move on. So just some basic principles. Again, this is, to this group, I think, sort of gospel. Ensuring service reliability. The commission is going to be asking MDOT to prioritize funding for essential projects and comment on the deferrals. We're going to ask them directly to reconsider the proposed cuts to MTA funding and explain why, because of the disproportionate impact on underserved communities and the impact on riders generally, and also to help achieve a more equitable distribution of funding resources. We need leadership. We have leadership. We truly do have leadership. We just have to come up with a path. Otherwise, we're gonna perpetuate a cycle of disinvestment. The CTP process, as you probably know, involves this somewhat antiquated so-called tour, which I think will finally change next year. But the CTP tour goes to every jurisdiction. The secretary and the modal administrators present, and then they hear from the locals. That just happened in Baltimore City and County on Monday. Some of you know, some of you may have attended. It's happened in Howard and Anne Arundel as well. I'll just comment on the city tour in particular. I think it is noteworthy, and it has been remarked upon broadly, that never has anyone seen a CTP tour stop like that, where there has been as much engagement across a broad set of stakeholders, where there has been as much consistency in comments. And I strongly encourage you, if you have the time to do it, to go and look at both of those. I've been partly through the Baltimore County one, which just happened. I'm going to look at the others, but I did view the entire city one, and it was state delegates, it was city council members, of course, the mayor himself, and other leaders in the community, advocates, business leaders from the Baltimore Transit Future Coalition, which is the Greater Baltimore Committee and the Greater Washington Partnership, and Johns Hopkins as a representative major employer, all saying the same thing, which is these cuts are unacceptable. We know you're trying. We know it's not your fault directly, but everybody must acknowledge that these are unacceptable proposals, and there has to be a solution. So I would encourage you to plug into that in any way you can. Obviously, you are already plugged into it because Transit Choices is on the scene doing work, but we should be talking about ways that you as an organization, and the many people on this call, I see we've got quite a few, 46, can participate in building this coalition. We started it, I think, last year when we reversed some of the cuts. We need to sustain it, and we need to keep our foot on the accelerator, if you will, to make sure that the system receives the attention that it deserves. Clearly, there's going to have to be a conversation about revenues, because it is fundamentally a revenue problem. I think this group probably knows about the Train Commission, which was convened last year and worked for a year and made some recommendations for enhancements. I'm sure you followed that in the last General Assembly session. There was, after some very difficult negotiations, additional monies were found. Some additional monies were found, recognizing that it was not going to be a long-term solution. The Train Commission was, and folks may not know this perfectly well, but the Train Commission was essentially reconfigured and shrunk in size to be a much smaller group. And it is now obligated to report on January 1 on revenue recommendations. It has not met since it was reconstituted. So it's going to have a lot of work to do between now and the General Assembly session. But it is, the TRAIN stands for Transportation Revenue and Infrastructure Needs. It is specifically dedicated to the question of transportation revenues. And, clearly everybody knows that's what we need to do. There are innumerable politics and other issues around the question of raising revenue, but we're going to have to figure out how to do it in a way that is acceptable, that is saleable and feasible in the legislature, and at the same time gets the job done. So that's my big part one, and it's the bigger part, I promise, of what I wanted to talk about today. I also promised that I would talk a little bit about our study of the merits of a regional transit authority. There's been discussion about what a regional transit authority might look like. Again, remember, and I alluded to this earlier, that we are very unusual, and that MTA is a mode solely of the MDOT family of modes. It reports, the administrator reports the secretary, reports the governor. Again, these are all great people, at least in the current administration, but it is an unusual system. It's a bit of a black box, and while it allows sometimes for you to benefit from the fact that there's a giant MDOT budget that gets allocated among modes, it also means that it's hard sometimes to figure out the numbers, and it's also hard to take sort of real independent responsibility for the particular mode that you're concerned about. I think everybody knows that there are all sorts of other regional models across the country that range from, well, I'll talk about it in a minute, that range from true authorities to, sorry, thanks, Don, true authorities to sort of entities that have somewhat more limited authority. The commission, the study that we have commissioned is going to outline the key issues and potential next steps. It'll look at key implementation planning and action steps, narrow options for some governance structures, and begin to talk about potential funding levels. This will be just kind of a first step, but I think for a long time coming, we've needed to have a conversation in the state about the unusual nature of our system, which again does have positives, but it is a sort of an outlier. And I think there needs to be a discussion about whether, this outlier, whether the time has come to consider whether this is not the best way for us to do this. Regional Transit Authority is about talking. It's about talking about local authority, local autonomy, all the things that we sometimes complain about, and the potential for new funding sources that we might be able to bring to the table. You can go ahead to the next slide. And we're looking at a couple of different governance models to try and figure out how to balance what I would say is sort of increased decision-making authority at the local or regional level with the obligation to provide funds. The system is funded by the state, and all of these models that you might talk about do have some sort of local or regional contribution. So you have to figure out what that looks like. You have to figure out how much it is, how much is equitable, how you balance that. And there are some real, very complicated conversations about whether people are willing to permit additional funds to be raised in that fashion. I think everybody knows that Maryland has. Let me say it this way: there's a lot of conversation in all sorts of circles about sales tax, right? I think everybody knows that in Maryland there is no local option sales tax. Local governments cannot impose a supplemental sales tax. It's a state sales tax. The state then decides what to do with the sales tax. In many conversations about many different initiatives, the question of, for example, local sales tax comes up. Local jurisdictions are not authorized to do that. Should they be? Do they want to? If they did, how would that work? What could different jurisdictions, particularly jurisdictions of more limited means like the city, expect in terms of being able to raise revenue more locally? So all those funding issues have to be sorted out, and many pitfalls and problems that have to be addressed. Structurally, you have on the screen at least two big options in terms of the actual structure of the entity. One is the idea of a true independent transit authority that would be responsible for day-to-day operations and management. It's, as you see, service planning, scheduling, routes, maintenance, financial management, board of directors, representative in some way. That's kind of the SEPTA model, which I guess people are familiar with, a true independent authority. But, SEPTA has a complicated funding mechanism, and you would have to figure out who's willing to pay for it, and who's willing to give up control, who wants what control in order to be willing to contribute to it. And I always talk about the funding first, at least generally, because in my view, the funding model drives the governance model, in the sense that depending on how you're going to fund it, that's going to drive what people are expecting in terms of their ability to control what happens where. Second model on your screen is a so-called fiduciary commission. We use the word fiduciary to distinguish it, frankly, from the current BRTC, because the current BRTC does not have control over the revenues or over the budget. It's just not where we are at the moment. We have an advisory role. We are trying to be as involved as possible in financial aspects, as you can well see, but there are models in which that you have a commission that is responsible for collecting revenue, for dispersing revenue, ensuring essentially long-term financial sustainability and public fund stewardship, with, again, a variety of appointment structures, but not operational control, not ownership. And these are, the Independent Transit Authority is complicated for many reasons, including, for example, that all the assets would have to be transferred to an independent authority. There are labor agreements that exist with MTA that creates concerns and questions for labor representatives and the unions who represent various people. So this is a very, very complicated endeavor, but it's an endeavor that has been a long time coming, at least to explore it, because it really hasn't been explored. And together, hopefully, we'll figure out, with all the pressures we're having on finances, whether some restructuring, whether it's a small restructuring or radical restructuring of transit governance and funding in the metro area makes sense. So that's I think the substance of what I wanted to convey to you. I would say to keep an eye on this authority issue. We are starting to get more details back from the consultants whom we've engaged. I think at the next meeting in November, we will have even more, and you're welcome to tune in to that or review the materials online afterwards on the website. And then to return to where I started, we are building a powerful coalition here. I think a coalition that I've not seen before. I'm hoping that the commission is playing a role in making that happen, but it's certainly not just the commission. It's everybody across all the stakeholder groups who are really pulling together, realize that we have an administration that wants to do this, that we need to help it find a way to do it, and everybody recognizes the crisis that we're in, and that there needs to be a solution in terms of funding and available resources for regional transit in Baltimore. So, Robin, Jimmy, that's what I've got for you today. I think I've left you some time for questions. Welcome questions, comments, and certainly the kind of quality discussion I'm always happy to see at Transit Choices call. So thanks so much. And Don, you can take the slides down, I think.
On behalf of Transit Choices, we want to let you know sincerely how much we both appreciate and respect all of the hard work that the commission is doing. We look at it as a very thoughtful, rational approach to looking at these very serious, challenges that we're facing. So, we applaud your efforts and, those of the commission to date. Transit Choices stands by you, with you. We're happy to help and support in any way we can, because as you so accurately stated, these are very, very critical times. And I think that your presentation, to see it in black and white, really drives home, the critical state that we are in, that people need to pay attention to be able to solve some of these really big issues. And we also very much appreciate your acknowledgement of the MTA, the hard work that, Holly Arnold and her team are doing every single day to deliver, really reliable transit service. So again, thank you for all that you're doing. At this juncture, what we'd like to do is to open the floor to questions, comments, feedback. You might either put something in the chat or you may raise your hand. For those of you that are not on camera, if it's possible to show your bright, shiny faces, it sort of enhances the interaction of our conversation. So please do so. We would greatly appreciate that. Do I see Joe Nathanson? Do you have a question or comment? Joe, you're on mute.
I will just echo what you said. I appreciate the hard work that Jon Laria and his commission are engaged in, and look forward to their further efforts and recommendations.
Thank you.
Transit Choices is never shy.
No, we're not.
I have a question, Robin. Can you hear
Yes, please.
Part of the motivation for forming the BRTC was the cancellation of the red line by the previous governor. And I'm wondering, in your conversations about the future, is part of that conversation finding a way that will prevent a single individual, even if he's governor, from canceling a project that was 12 years in the making and had already spent $250 million. It doesn't seem right that a single individual could cancel such an effort. So are you all discussing that?
No, we have not discussed it yet. I don't know exactly what that would look like. I mean, I appreciate the feedback and certainly share the sentiment that I guess part of the reason I respond that way is I'm more focused on trying to figure out how to get the red line built than to worry about who can cancel it if we finally get committed. The problem right now is that I didn't really say this directly, but in the draft CTP, there is planning money, and I forget how much, for the red line, but there is no construction money, and the CTP goes out 6 years, right? So at the moment, there is literally no plan or methodology to pay for the red line. Now, I think people know that there's a federal process. Remember, of course, what you're alluding to was $900 million in federal funds that got given back by the prior administration. So it is a big question, and I didn't really touch on it today. I guess I might have or should have, but the CTP does not augur well for the red line in its current, in its draft form. And I know that the governor is committed to the red line. I know that the state is committed to the red line. I think the first step here is to try and figure out how to get a funding package in place that will allow us to do the red line. But you raise a good point, Jimmy, about whether we can once we've done that, can we figure out how to make sure that particularly a long-term project like that doesn't face in the future some change in elected officials or otherwise that could cause it to retreat again.
So John, just to piggyback on what Jimmy mentioned regarding the red line, a question that Transit Choices receives all of the time is, given the present, transportation landscape in terms of the proposed, budget cuts, is the red line a reality? I mean, there are so many other transportation issues, state of good repair. I mean, look what's going. I mean, there are just so many issues with respect to what we have on the ground currently. People are asking more and more that question of us. And how would you respond to that?
Well, I have no doubt that the governor is seriously committed to the red line, and I have no doubt that therefore the state is seriously committed to the red line. So I have to assume that it will be a reality if we put our minds to it. Obviously, there are lots of steps along the way, including procuring federal funds, without which it won't be done. But we do have to make commitments showing that the seriousness of that support. I think one of the things that we have said that was said at the commission, that was said at the CTP, is that, you know, one of the factors in competing effectively for federal funds for the Red Line is having an adequate commitment to state of good repair. You know, that applies in the formula, the way the rankings, however you call it, that the federal government applies. So, you know, to me, we have to keep our eye on the Red Line, and I really do think we have our eye on it. But we also, at the same time, have to be investing in state of good repair, both for its own sake, because you need to invest in state of good repair for all the reasons I described, and you know, and also because, frankly, it is to me, a predicate step for an effective and successful application for federal Red Line funds. So you know, until I hear otherwise, my view is the Red Line remains critical. The Red Line remains something that we can achieve, and I'm looking forward to supporting the governor and the state in any way that we can to make sure it becomes a reality.
So at the moment, I'm having a difficult time. I've got a technical glitch looking at chat. Are there chat messages, John and or Dawn, that you can see from some of the meeting participants?
Well,
Greg. Yeah, I put in so I'm Greg Newmark, I teach at Oregon State. I put in a chat message on the revenue side, which is like, given just, you know, terrible congestion from my perspective on 695, is there any talk of congestion pricing or other tools that are being used in other metro regions to fund transit, you know, happening here in Maryland?
I think that the Train Commission, which I served on in its first year until it was reconfigured, and I should just to be clear, because everybody will want to know this, the Train Commission got reconfigured and made much smaller. The original Train Commission, to some extent, has been moved to more advisory capacity. So I've been asked to serve on this kind of advisory group so that the benefit of all those different perspectives that were at Train last year can remain engaged in the process. And hopefully that will happen as we get rolling. But Greg, I think the Train Commission looked at all sorts of options, and I think this came up as well. You know, we didn't get as far as I think we clearly didn't get as far as we needed to in that first stub year, because it wasn't a full year of the Train Commission to really get to all sorts of options, including things like congestion pricing. So I don't, you know, I know it's been raised as a possibility. You know, there's going to be an awful lot of balancing of possibility, you know, versus feasibility, you know, revenue, you know, sort of what would yield the most, but what are you likely to get done? And I think all these things are going to be on the table. It's not, you know, I'm not sure I have the sort of capacity to make any of that happen, but we do need to be talking about all of those things. It's hard to get road users and their elected representatives to draw upon road users' pocketbooks to fund transit. But that is enlightened leadership, and that does have to happen at some point if we're going to start to shift the mode balance from you know, road users, vehicle traffic over to transit. And I hope that shift is coming, and that we'll be able to accelerate it.
Thank you.
John, I have a question about the study that you're working with consultants on. You may have said this. If you did, I apologize. But when is a recommendation going to be released? What's the time frame for that?
The study?
Yes.
Well, I think it's crystallizing. I think we've had a couple of preliminary presentations. I think that we will have a robust presentation at the November meeting of the commission, which forgive me for not having the date. It's the first Friday, whatever the first Friday of November is. I guess that would be
it's actually on the second Friday. It's
second Friday. I'm sorry. Yeah. It's the 8th, and those are streamed if you want to watch them. So I think, and I want to manage your expectations a little bit. I mean, there's been so little discussion about the authority in the broader context that what we're trying to do here is to make sure that the discussion gets rolling and kick it off, frame the issues, start to educate people who have not thought about this at all, about potential governance structures by reference to other structures with which they might be familiar, like SEPTA, Northern Virginia, and so on, WMATA. and also to start talking about funding. But as you can imagine, I mean, it's not going to be a consultant, nor is the BRTC going to be able to say, we've thought about all this, and we think that what you really ought to do is this structure with these funding sources. I think it would be presumptuous, but I do think we have a very legitimate role in making sure the conversation happens, in starting the conversation, and being there for the conversation. So I think it will be very, very useful. But I also want folks to understand that this is not going to be sort of a, we've studied all of this and here's the thing we think you should do.
That's great to manage expectations. So, we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions, comments, feedback?
John, it seems to me that we're back to, in a lot of ways, the issues that took the airport, the bus system, or the transit system, and the port away from the city of Baltimore. Financial and incompetent management, both. And I worry that, particularly with the city side of the MTA, that financially, whatever plan is put forth, that the issue for the city is, yeah, you could find a sales tax or something, but we've got a property tax problem, which takes an enormous amount of money out of the pockets of people. And to kind of look at that and try to figure out how to squeeze the rock a little bit more is going to be very, very difficult.
Yep.
When you're looking at a regional operation. So I know you're aware of that, but I think people forget that all these entities used to be independent. And we took a lot of credit for creating a consolidated transportation program in the state of Maryland. We were the first and probably still one of the only ones like this.
Sure.
That includes all those entities. So it's a tough deal.
Hans, I agree. I mean, like I said, it seemed like a great idea at the time, and it has been a great idea in many respects. There are many benefits to the current structure, even though it is highly unusual. And I am absolutely committed to a diligent effort to understand whether another model might be better, because I think the time has come to evaluate whether another model might be better. It seems obvious that we should be looking at it, but I am not prepared to commit to the idea that another model is necessarily better, because you have all these questions about funding. You have questions about how jurisdictions like the city, which is under-resourced to begin with, could either tax itself or its residents further to contribute, because there would have to be a local contribution. And I'll also say that when I was in the General Assembly last year talking about this with people, I was hearing from some folks, well, an authority might be a good idea because then the state wouldn't have to pay for it. And I was like, time out. That is not what's happening here. It would be a balance of some kind between the state and the local governments. And it has to be, you have to rely on sources that are reasonable, that are feasible, that the local governments are willing to stand behind, and that they can responsibly commit to on behalf of their own stakeholders and taxpayers. So it's a very, very complicated conversation, and yet it's a conversation that at least needs to be had with all the caveats that you described and that I've described and other people have talked about. So we'll see where it goes, but I think the commission felt like we needed to have the conversation. We had the ability to get the conversation going, and we're committed to doing that. And then we're just going to have to all be part of a conversation to figure out, what the merits are and whether it is feasible to do this, or not. I just don't really know yet. I just know that the current system, obviously, based upon the outcomes, is not raising the resources that it needs to run the system effectively, or certainly to expand the system. And everybody knows that we need to not only run it effectively, but we need to expand it. And those are big and expensive challenges.
Thank you, John. So we're approaching, I believe it's 9:25. We will conclude promptly at 9:30. If we have people joining us this morning for the first time, and you would like to hear about upcoming meetings as well as receive all of the meeting materials, if you would please put contact information in the chat, we would be happy to communicate with you after this meeting. And then I also wanted to let everyone know to mark your calendars for the next Transit Choices meeting, which is going to be held on a different day, Tuesday, November 19th. We are going to have as our featured guest speakers, Baltimore City DOT, Stu Sirota, Deputy Director, and he's also hired 2 sort of key positions within his management team. So those individuals will be introduced, and they're going to talk about what their roles and responsibilities will be moving forward, as well as the projects and priorities that Baltimore City DOT is focusing on this year and beyond. So as always, you'll be receiving meeting notices and announcements, but I just wanted to mention that before we conclude today. Jimmy, would you like to provide the closing remarks, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I would like to close with my usual comments. Thanks you, John, for your presentation, thorough presentation, and for all the work you've done over the years to help improve Baltimore's transit system, as well as the very key role that you're playing now. So I really, Transit Choices offers your thanks and appreciation of what you've done. And then I always like to thank all the people who tune in, because you all are playing a very important role. By tuning into these meetings, it enables us to attract great presenters like John. And so in a way, just attending these meetings is helping to advocate for a better public transit system. So we value your participation greatly, and encourage you to encourage other people to participate. We always want to be expanding our audience. So thank you.
This will conclude our meeting for this morning. I echo Jimmy's comments and sentiments and wish you all a wonderful day. We will be sharing both the presentation and the recording from today's meeting within the next day or so. So thank you. Take care.
Thanks.